We are live.
All right. This is Senate Judiciary picking up again with testimony on F4, an act relating to reducing crimes of violence associated with juveniles and dangerous weapons. First witness is Lauren Hirsch, National Director, World Without Exploitation.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I am joined by my colleague, Audrey Morrissey, who's the co-director of My Life, My Choice. I'll tell you just a little bit about Audrey in just a moment, but I just want to give you a brief introduction to World Without Exploitation and to me. I'm the National Director of World Without Exploitation. World Without Exploitation is the largest human trafficking coalition in the country. To date, we have about 225 member organizations from around the country. Many of those organizations are survivor-led. So we are spending a lot of time putting our ear to the ground and really listening to the voices and stories of survivors. In my prior life, I was a New York City prosecutor where I was the chief of the sex trafficking unit. I share this because throughout my career, both in my capacity at World Without Exploitation and as a prosecutor, I have seen up close and personal just how guns and human trafficking are inextricably linked. Put simply, in nearly every human trafficking case that I handled, a gun was present. I'm not saying that in every situation the trigger was pulled, but guns are routinely used in trafficking schemes as a way to exert force, fraud, and coercion over victims. And that is why we at World Without Exploitation and our partners are particularly grateful for this forward-thinking legislation that truly and uniquely connects the dots between human trafficking and guns. Before I go any further, I want to introduce my colleague, Audrey Morrissey. Audrey is the co-director of My Life, My Choice, a Boston-based trafficking organization that helps young people, minors, who have been trafficked. Audrey is also uniquely positioned because she is a survivor herself. She is, quite frankly, one of the most insightful leaders on human trafficking that I have worked with over my almost 2 decades in this field. And so I'm honored to sit alongside Audrey Morrissey.
Thank you, Lauren. Good morning, everyone. I'm Audrey Morrissey. I'm the co-executive director of My Life, My Choice. I first want to thank you for giving me this opportunity. My Life, My Choice is a program that's based in Massachusetts, in Boston, Massachusetts. We've been around for 20 years. We do a lot of work around, we have a prevention curriculum that is used in 32 states across the country. To prevent youth from being recruited into the commercial sex industry. We also have a mentoring program where we pair adult survivors with adolescent trafficked youth for a one-on-one mentoring relationship. And so when I talked to Lauren and about this convening, automatically I was like, oh my God. We serve youth under the age of 18. And one thing is for sure, we serve all across Massachusetts. We've dealt with kids who were trafficked into Massachusetts that have been from all over, Vermont. I mean, trafficking, kids are moved all over. And so I think we all understand that, that children are trafficked all through New England. But one of the things that first came to mind when I talked with Lauren, one of the things I want to be clear about, gang members are cashing in on trafficking minors, and gang members are always using force. I've heard countless stories of gang members using guns to force youth into trafficking. And as Lauren said, They might not have been used in a way of like, I'm going to shoot you, but in that threatening manner. I've heard stories where they pulled out guns with the coercion saying, if you don't do this for me, I will have your little sister. I will kill your brother. And so what we know is that the young people, they already know what gang members are capable of. They've all lost family members, peers to gang violence. And so when a gang member presents a gun and says, if you don't do this for me, I'll kill someone in your family or your brother. I think of a young person that talked about being held in a room with gang members who basically had their guns, like on their laps. And the way that they were trafficking this young person was via video. And so while this young person has these gang members on one side of the room and this camera on, and she's doing all of these sex acts through the camera, and this buyer is constantly paying. I mean, what would be more intimidating than that, right? And I say that to say, even as a survivor, when you think about guns and trafficking, when we're talking youth, a lot of our youth, again, the gang members are the traffickers, which means they're carrying guns, they're trafficking guns, drugs, and girls. And it's really, really, it's disturbing. I mean, it is a lifestyle where, that gang rivalry stuff plays out here. I will talk of one instance in Massachusetts where a young woman who was, I think she's like 18 or 19, in a hotel, who a gang member had put her in it was an upscale hotel in Boston, and he did the violence. He shot and killed her and left her in that hotel room. And so and the gang members are definitely folks who have learned. They know that you can sell a gun once, a drug once, but you can sell a human being over and over again. They also know the power of which weapons. They're making sure that these young girls see them with these weapons. I've heard young people talk about, watching them clean their weapons. I know of young people that we served who are now doing time because not only were they sex trafficked, they were used to hold guns, to traffic guns or hold guns. And when the police pulled a car over, the trafficker put the gun on the young woman who was still in jail to this day. She was sentenced, and because of the threats and being exposed to traffickers who are carrying guns, she's not going to tell that this was their gun. Now, our law enforcement, they know that the gun did not belong to this victim, but because she didn't, right? Because for fear of her life, right? And so when you think of guns, not only to make victims work for them, but it's also a way to intimidate them so that they won't tell that this person is their trafficker. And so a lot of young people who've been trafficked have also been used to set other people up who have been killed, right? And so I can go on and on about a lot of the cases that trafficking victims, gun charges that trafficking victims have on their record are in jail for because their trafficker, who might have police stopped in the car, put their weapons on these young people and say it's yours. And so It all goes hand in hand. Trafficking with our gang members, trafficking, guns, drugs, it's all hand in hand. You cannot have one without the other. And so I urge you to really, really understand this, pay attention to this issue. We know most guns are in the hands of the wrong people, right? And this is no different. Trafficking is no different. And we have to do something about this. We have to understand this connection and the power of weapons to intimidate our young girls. And I'll say this too. A lot of the last thing I'm going to say about that, a lot of our young people who are in child welfare systems, who say, yeah, I'm in a gang, and they have to work for these gangs, but they feel like, that's their family and their protection, and they're exposed to guns. They're all carrying. You cannot even be in this lifestyle, even as a trafficker, without carrying weapons, because the chances of confrontations with other traffickers, it's very, very ugly.
Yeah, question from Senator.
Hi, thank you for testifying. I have a question that could be for one or both of you, Warren or Audrey. And I don't know if you have the bill in front of you, but I'm looking at page 6, section 5, line 13, regarding the demand of another person to purchase a firearm for them. And, this has been the straw man purchasing of firearms. And, one of my concerns is, people who are being trafficked and exploited, they can be exploited for a number of different things, one of which could be purchasing a firearm. Do you feel that having the word demand in there could be problematic for people who are being exploited?
You know what? I actually would love to look at this section a little more carefully, if you don't mind, and get back to you on that language. I could give you my gut, but I'd rather be very thoughtful about that particular word to give you sort of our insight on that, if that's okay.
I will add, though, can I just say this? What we do know too is that they call them straw purchasers, straw buyers, where young people are used, sent to the gun shows and different things. They have the IDs, the clean records. I know of one young person who, and she talks about it, how she was a young college student, and she was sent to buy these guns for these traffickers / gang members. And she ended up going to jail, but her point was, she got out and she's a spokesperson now, but her point was nobody even questioned her. She was buying semi-automatic guns, right? And they would just sell them to her.
Yeah. I'm looking at the language right now, and I think in terms of at the request of or demand of, I see exactly where you're going with this, because I could certainly see a scenario where a trafficker demanded a victim to purchase a weapon. I think I certainly could see that. I just want to look a little more carefully at it, but I appreciate you flagging that. Are you okay with me just sort of continue? I wanted to introduce Audrey. I wanted you to hear from her perspective, sort of the on the ground in the trenches. But if you don't mind, I just would love to just, I have some short additional remarks that I'd love to continue with your permission.
That's fine. I just point out that language mirrors the federal law.
Okay, that's helpful to know. I didn't know that.
The demand and that other language run directly.
Yeah. And ideally, a prosecutor would use his or her discretion and dig a little deeper and in understanding the dynamics, but that does require that the victim is forthcoming if there were to be a prosecution there. And that's a big
The
if.
federal law is correct, but
That's what I was gonna say.
I'm sorry, say it again?
I said it doesn't mean the federal law is correct. It just, the
Yeah.
language came from the federal law. That's,
Yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful. I hear you. I mean, listen, if our system was set up so that, you know, people could be particularly victims, trafficking victims could be forthcoming in these instances, I think we'd be able to peel back the layers and identify the person who should really be held accountable.
we'd be happy to hear your remarks that you prepared.
Perfect. So I want to just make sure that
Thank
we're
you
sort
very
of
much
all
for your testimony.
great. I want to make sure that we're all speaking the same language. And when we talk about sex trafficking, we're talking about when a prostitution act is induced through force, fraud, or coercion, or in a situation where there is a position of power and position of vulnerability, or where the person who's being induced is a minor. Those are obviously the cases that Audrey sees day in and day out. No doubt, you know, sex trafficking is happening everywhere. Vermont is not exempt. As a prosecutor, I had a number of cases where the person who was being bought and sold was in New York City was originally bought and sold in Vermont and then brought to New York City. Traffickers use a variety of tactics to lure victims in and to control victims: physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. Oftentimes, and I would say this is the norm and not the exception, guns are used as a mechanism to coerce and control victims. There is no easier way to get someone to do exactly what you want than by brandishing a gun. The trigger never needs to be pulled for the harm to be done. I did a really quick sort of 30-second Google search to demonstrate the connection between sex trafficking and firearms possession. And in about an instant, I found that a day ago in Queens, New York, a defendant lured a 14-year-old into prostitution, repeatedly raped her, and sold her for sex. When the police executed the search warrant, they found 2 loaded, operable firearms. In that same search, just below, a Maryland man was sentenced for sex trafficking and firearms possession. Below that, a Florida man was charged with sex trafficking and firearm possession. Right, you get where we're going here. And it didn't take me very long to find that a Burlington man was also charged with sex trafficking and the possession of firearm. And this is precisely why adding human trafficking to the list of offenses designated in this particular legislation is so critical. Traffickers cause long-term harm, significant trauma, and the harm to victims oftentimes cannot be undone. Often this is done in conjunction with the use of a weapon. Guns should never be in the hands of dangerous people, full stop. And sex traffickers are amongst the most dangerous in society. As you navigate the complexity of this bill, I am happy to be a resource, specifically in the area. I know the bill is much more comprehensive, but I'm happy to be a resource, particularly in the area of human trafficking. Again, World Without Exploitation is immensely grateful that Vermont is taking on this important issue, and we look forward to making Vermont safer alongside of you. For not just victims, but everyone, by preventing guns from getting in the hands of sex traffickers, or all traffickers to that matter.
Thank you. Are there questions for either Lauren or Audrey?
Yeah, I just have a quick one, Lauren or Audrey, thanks for being here today. I was just curious, and you may not know this answer, whatever else. Can you tell me if the state of Massachusetts has anything similar to what you're viewing today or anything in the works?
At this particular moment, right off my head, I can look into that, but I'm not sure if they have. We haven't testified on a bill such as this yet, but that doesn't mean that it's not occurring, because we're working on some other bills that we're focused on right now. But that is something that I could look into.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Other questions for either Audrey or Lauren? Hey, thank you so much for making time with us today, and We appreciate the good work that both of you do. So appreciate it. We're
Thank
gonna
you so much.
gonna
Thank
hear
you.
from either Marshall or Rebecca can go first. Whoever wants to go first. Marshall, you're first up on my list, but knowing you both work for the same person, I didn't want to.
We do both work for the same person, but I am going to deal with, we are going to deal with separate parts of this bill. And I'm specifically going to talk about the parts of this bill that deal with juvenile law. And so that launches us right off into section 1. And what section 1 really does here is it has the effect of adding new offenses to the big 12 list of offenses that must originate from the criminal division if they're committed by somebody who's aged 14 years old. And so to begin with, I'll start just to get it out of the way. We don't support this provision because we think it moves entirely in the wrong direction. To begin with, we're talking about 14-year-olds. 14-year-olds are incredibly young. Many 14-year-olds, I shouldn't say most, aren't even competent to stand trial in juvenile or adult court simply because they don't have enough cognitive capability to make the rational decisions that you have to make just to simply conduct yourself in court and make the kind of decisions that you have to make on the fly in court as a defendant every day. So in a lot of cases, when we have 14-year-olds and we have them tested to determine whether they're competent, they're found to be not competent just simply because of their developmental age. And so to say that we think that we want to expand the types of offenses that 14-year-olds not only can, but must be sent to adult criminal court for is already a pretty heavy lift. And so then we get to the list of offenses, and it's 3 offenses. And honestly, the list of offenses is, from my perspective, kind of weird. And the reason is the first 2 offenses are drug trafficking and human trafficking. And the fact of the matter is that to the extent that we have people who are young, youth, who are getting involved in drug trafficking and human trafficking, pretty much 100% of the time, they are victims as well. Youth are not trafficking other human beings unless they themselves have been caught up in one way or another in that same circumstance. We don't see young people being charged with human trafficking, period. So if this were to pass, we actually don't think it would have a very substantial effect because it's not like the juvenile courts have many, if any, human trafficking cases in them now that would be shifted over to the adult courts. But we do think that it's really sort of incongruous to say that this offense in particular, one where, you know, really the only path into it as a young person is through victimization, through your own victimization, should be one where everyone starting at age 14 must go into the criminal system. We just think is inappropriate because frankly, it's their very juvenile nature that allows them to get trapped in these circumstances in the first place. And therefore we shouldn't be excluding them from the juvenile courts. I think the same thing, though, probably to a lesser degree about drug trafficking. Drug trafficking is not the same as drug possession, drug sales, drug distribution. Drug trafficking is an offense that's reserved for people who are transporting large quantities of drugs, very expensive amounts of drugs, not retail quantities, not stuff that people are selling to their friends or selling to their compatriots. Nobody who's 16, 17, 18 years old is getting involved in drug trafficking on their own. There are no 16-year-old mastermind drug traffickers. Those are people who themselves are victims and have been brought into a world of drug trafficking by older adults. And so focusing on those kids and saying, we want to take those 14-year-olds and put them automatically into the adult court system when the only way a 14-year-old can wind up in a drug trafficking world is for themselves to be victimized by older adults, we just think, again, is inappropriate and sort of incongruous. That gets us to the last one, which is the offense of committing a felony while in possession of a dangerous weapon. And our problem there is that it captures way too many children. To begin with, children carry weapons. They carry weapons way more than adults. They do so compulsively. They don't understand why they do it. And it's something that's been studied pretty extensively. And in fact, one of the best examples of it is if you look at the youth risk behavior surveys that go out all across the country. I don't remember if they do them every year or not, but on a very regular basis. You'll see that 1 in 5 kids under the age of 18 regularly carry a gun, knife, or club at any given time. That is a very high number. And it actually tracks very well with the statistics that we see, not so much that is youth-based risk behavior survey, we're looking at numbers nationwide that have, so we're not looking specifically at Vermont, but it tracks very much with what we see nationwide when we see kids getting arrested, especially in states where there's a lot more stop and frisk type conduct where kids are actually having police encounters on the street a lot more. You actually see really high numbers of kids being charged with possession of a deadly or dangerous weapon in states where that's not allowed. So to begin with, we just have the fact that kids tend to carry weapons, even when they don't intend to use them, even when they don't have a plan to use them. It comes out most strongly with kids who have been through the child welfare system or have been in other ways victimized. Kids who do not feel safe do things in order to make themselves feel safe. Now, realistically, it does not make the kid any safer. A kid who feels unsafe because they themselves have been victims of crime at home, victims of crime in the streets, are not made any safer by carrying a gun, but they sure feel safer by carrying a gun. And so they do. Same with knives, very typical. So for one thing, we're just talking about a provision that would sweep in a real lot of kids. And then when it comes to committing a felony, it's actually really easy to commit a felony. So just to give you a couple of examples, any 14-year-old kid with a jackknife in their backpack who spray paints on the wall of their school, chances are pretty good that that's going to be a felony in possession of a deadly weapon, because spray painting on the wall of a school, if that exceeds $900 worth of damage, which having done a number of spray painting cases, I'm always shocked that they turn out to be felonies and not misdemeanors. It actually takes a lot of money to get a building cleaned off, and it's pretty easy for a kid who spray paints the side of the school to wind up with a felony. And if they happen to have a knife in their backpack while they do it, well, now we're taking a 14-year-old for spray painting on the side of the school and throwing them mandatorily into the adult court system. Same, for example, with a 14-year-old kid who throws a firecracker in a porta potty. I had one of those cases. And that is unlawful mischief with an explosive device. That's an automatic felony, and the explosive device is itself a dangerous or deadly weapon. Same with a 16-year-old who's, say, a cook at a restaurant, a line cook, who's carrying a box cutter for opening packages and decides that they're going to steal a brisket to take home and cook over the weekend. As someone who's spent a lot of my life working in restaurants, theft from restaurants by employees is almost a given. And if that,
my understanding of these provisions is that it originates in the adult, but it can go back to the family court, either through youthful offender or the charges.
you could do it that way, but the damage is done. By the time you take a 14-year-old, certainly.
Years ago, it was 16. Your objection is the dangerous weapon is so broad that if you just did firearms, it'd be less broad.
That would certainly narrow it and improve it a lot.
Pardon me?
That narrowing it to firearm would certainly narrow the
And
scope
if
of it.
you limit it to 16, as we had in the original draft that I changed, where it even got introduced, would go back to what it was previously, would not necessarily treat it as same as a Big 12 because it would be limited to 16.
I think that would be a great improvement. I still worry.
Understood, but I'm not asking you to say I'm all for this, but those are just two ways to ameliorate to some extent. When I hear you talking about 14-year-olds, that's not really the group. We were focused on 16, 17, 18-year-olds.
So I would agree that would narrow it. We would still have concerns, and I want to mention.
No, I don't think you say, oh, I support this.
Right.
I'm just offering those as. Oh,
With that understood, I'd like to mention one other concern that wouldn't address. Go ahead, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Can I ask a question real quick? I don't want to disrupt your train of thought here, but if this were to go through and there are juveniles who originate in the criminal division, would that create an additional hearing that the state's attorney would have to go through to remove that case back to the family division?
Yes, not only an additional hearing, but also a public record that wouldn't otherwise be created. And that public record, even though it could be sealed and recorded, so the court record would no longer exist, what I call the Google record would be, there's no way to get rid of that. I used to live in Lamoille County. In Lamoille County, every arraignment, no matter what the age, if it's an adult arraignment, it's written in the News and Citizen, just a description of the name, what they were arraigned for. So that becomes, as soon as you Google that name, their name will always be associated with that offense, even if it was very promptly moved down to the juvenile court. And it still leaves a problem with constructive possession. So it's a shame she's off already, but I think her name was Ms. Morrissey, Andrea Morrissey, I think she was. She testified about a circumstance that spoke exactly to this situation, which is there's a principle in law that when a group of people are found essentially all in proximity to an item, they are all considered to have possessed the item. So that, for example, if 5 kids got pulled over in a car, all age ranging, 14 to 17 years old, and in that car, in the trunk of that car, there was a few bags of heroin and a firearm, every single person in that car would be found to have constructively possessed that firearm and those drugs, meaning the 14-year-old, the 15-year-old, each and every one of them, because the law doesn't really have a way to deal with what do we do when you find a car and there's a gun in the car and nobody is taking ownership of the gun. And so that's what constructive possession is this idea that we can assign possession to anyone who's associated with it.
I just have a question about the scenario that you're posing. I mean, if for possession, at least from my understanding, if you have heroin in a car, it has to be within the lungeable area or on your person. If something's in the trunk, how are you proving possession of all the people in that car? I guess this
To
is.
keep it simple, I shouldn't have used the trunk, I should have used the armrest, the middle.
Yeah, maybe my question was kind of off topic for what we're talking.
No, but you're right, I shouldn't have used trunk as the example. I should have used the middle
console.
Console, the center console, exactly. And so the example that Ms. Morrissey gave, where there was a number of people in a car, one of whom, or maybe more of whom, but one of whom in particular was a victim of sex trafficking and who ended up being tagged with possession of the firearm, and she said is still serving that time because of that, is a perfect example. That is someone who was in a car, found to constructively possess a firearm that was located in the car with them. And what we are saying here is that that person would be therefore put into the adult court automatically and subject to the adult court, and we would find that to be objectionable. We also think it's important to look at this through a lens of racial disproportionality. When the Raise the Age law and youthful offenders law was passed, we talked a lot in this committee about racial disproportionality, and DCF was in here presenting some of their statistics about racial disproportionality in the juvenile justice system. At the time, and I want to say this was 2015, 2016, the only place that actually kept good numbers on race, good statistics on race, was Woodside. So it becomes very hard for us to compare our numbers today to our numbers back then because we no longer have Woodside, and that was the only source of good numbers. Now we're getting better numbers from the court system, but don't have anywhere to compare them to. But as recently as 2016, Black youth in Chittenden County were 700% more likely to wind up behind bars than their non-Black peers. 700% is a huge racial disparity. When I used to work at Woodside, even though 95% of the population of Vermont that's under the age of 18 is white, I would regularly go in there and my clientele there, my caseload being just the kids within Woodside, would be more than 50% Black or Hispanic or South Asian. So it was very, very racially disparate. And that was a lot of the discussion that.
How long ago was that?
That was 2016 was the most recent numbers that I keep tabs on, but those numbers were reported every year. DCF has to report those numbers to the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, which is actually why we report such a weird number. I always find it odd and a bit disconcerting that we report everything as Black versus non-Black, but that's at the request of OJJDP. That's how they want those numbers reported. They create a reporting regime.
Well, the reason I asked, I never saw those numbers that high at 204 Depot. No, we did have several persons of color, but we never had that kind of numbers. 50%. We were always maybe at 12 kids, maybe 2.
And actually, I believe he said it publicly, so I think I can say this. He said it in the press at some point. But when Sean Brown,
Yeah, I'm just, I don't.
for the first time, he noticed that I think there was.
And I don't know if they're seeing that today with the detained youth.
It's hard to say because today we don't really keep it, because we don't keep detained youth in one place. We don't keep a good track.
So it
So
would be interesting to know what that's.
absolutely, but I want to point out that in a lot of our raising age and youthful offender changes, we're designed in part to try to reduce the points of discretion in the system where we really sort of allowed those sort of racially disproportionate numbers to infect the system. And from our perspective, it's dangerous to move in a direction where we're creating sort of more discretion and more avenues for people to make judgments not based on sort of objective facts. What is this person accused of doing? What age are they? Where are they accused of having done it? But instead to just sort of make more kind of gut instinct level reactions, because statistically, that's where racist outcomes tend to affect these processes. And, I think that looking at it through that lens, you can see where we would worry. I mean, the presentation, the slideshow that was put up last week where they sort of highlighted a number of cases of youth in the Bennington County region that had been involved in dangerous and violent circumstances. And some of those were children who were accused of having perpetrated violence. Some of them were children who were just simply on the list because they were victims of violence. But in a state where more than 90% of youth are white, that was a list where more than 90% of youth were non-white. And that is exactly part of the fear when we start moving back towards creating more discretion, more avenues to differentiate these youth based on the types of offenses that they've committed, and to separate certain youth into the adult system and certain youth into the juvenile system, is that we'll start to see those racial disparities, which we have seen in the past, and we have seen them be dramatic and really horrifying to those of us who are doing the work, to see those start to reemerge. So it's for all those reasons that we're opposed to.
But the reality is the violence is real. Murders are real and the firearm violence is real. So my constituents are concerned about it, whether or not you want to, whatever way you look at it, it's real. It's not, it's the willingness to use firearms. It's the willingness to hold people hostage. It's the willingness to do all kinds of things. And I feel, there's certain sympathy for some of the kids that get involved in this, whether they be black, white, blue, purple, doesn't matter. The kids that are involved in this are in many cases unwitting. Going along for whatever reason, maybe their brother's being threatened to be murdered back home, I don't know. But, it's a system that is trying to respond at a time when, we're down 9 police officers in the police department. They're, trying to respond to a community emergency. And I think it's true, it's true elsewhere. It's certainly, I'm sympathetic, as you know, to what you're saying, but it's the reality of what my constituents are dealing with.
Absolutely. There's been this spike in violence, and it's not just in Bennington County, or for that matter, it's just in Vermont. It's all across the country. We've seen an increase in interpersonal violence in the last 2 years that is dramatic. As dramatic as it is in Vermont, it's been even more dramatic in some other jurisdictions. And I think the important thing to keep in mind is that shuffling kids into the adult system rather than the juvenile system does nothing to make our communities safer. In fact, it has the effect of making our communities more dangerous, because these kids are not going, whether they go to the juvenile system or the adult system, they're coming out. They're not going in forever. They're going to come out of jail or out of the juvenile system eventually. And what we know from the pathways to assistance studies that came out of Ohio and Arizona is that even youth who are charged with the most violent offenses, if they are put into the adult correctional system, they come out of that system more likely to commit further offenses than they went into it. And if they go into the juvenile system, they come out of that system less likely to commit further offenses than they went into it. And so I agree completely that the spike in violence is very concerning. I just think that moving kids from the juvenile system into the adult system is in fact counterproductive when it comes to how to address that spike in violence. I want to move on to Section 9, mainly because Section 9 is a fun one, because we actually, that's a juvenile one, and we don't disagree, we don't object to Section 9. That actually puts us in line with what happens in those states. And my favorite way to get to agree to legislation is when I get to come in and say, I thought that was already law. And that's one I thought was already law. I actually thought that subsection 1 already allowed for the reporting of these for national background check purposes. I was unaware that that wasn't already permitted under subsection 1, so we have no section with subsection 2 being added to say something that we thought subsection 1 already said. We're good with that.
It's actually a safer community tax.
Well, maybe I mixed up my sections here. I meant the section that was dealing with amending 33 VSA 5117 to allow information about juvenile arrests to be given to the National Crime Information Center.
It was part of the Safer Communities Act. I was stumbling over what the name of it was with somebody during the break.
I understood. So that's just one where we actually thought that was the law, and was surprised later to discover that it wasn't. I do want to talk about one thing that was not in the bill, because I do think it's something that should be addressed, and that I think there's a lot of appetite to address, and that's State's Attorney Marthage highlighted the problem of inefficiency regarding the path that some of these cases take when they start in the juvenile court, have to be transferred up to the adult court, and then down to the youthful offender court where they end up living. And that's actually a really long, complicated process. I agree with her completely on that. I think that is a long and complicated process that doesn't serve anybody very well. It doesn't serve the youth well, doesn't serve victims well, doesn't serve the courts well, doesn't serve the attorneys well. I disagree with the solution to that that's been proposed, which is to allow prosecutors to direct file those cases based on their discretion. Again, I get concerned whenever we allow prosecutorial discretion to decide where things get charged. And so my suggestion there is that we come up with, and I think this is something that probably a small group of people, Erica and me and a few other people could put together pretty quickly, would be a procedure by which when something starts in the juvenile court and there's a motion to transfer it up to the adult court, that at the same time, consideration could be made as to whether it should, rather than adult court, go youthful offender. So that we would basically skip one whole skip half the hearings, skip half the steps.
If you and Erica Mathis can agree on something, I would probably support it wholeheartedly, because I know both of you come at juvenile law perhaps from a different vantage point, but I know you're both concerned about the process. And when I heard about the ping pong, if we can solve the ping pong, if nothing else happens in the bill, it would be positive. Because one of the things about kids is the quicker that you can have a resolution to the court case, the quicker they can move on, whatever, whether they're an adult, juvenile, or youthful offender, the quicker they can move on. And anything that delays the process for kids is particularly difficult. So
I agree, and it's not really apropos to the bill, but one of the conversations that I was having with Erica about this that I think is.
Well, I think the administration has some suggestions, and I think they would further complicate. So if we could.
I'll hold off on the administration suggestions because I agree they further complicate.
So my suggestion is if you and Erica can work together, I'd be happy to work with the two of you to integrate.
I am absolutely happy to do that. The one other thing I want to talk about before I sit down, because I think the rest of this, and this is really, this is Rebecca's section because this part's about guns, and but I want to talk about it also because it is about kids also, and that's section 8. And I'm not going to address the parts of this that Rebecca will address that are about the constitutionality and sort of the federal landscape of decisions around firearms. But this is the provision that bans people under the age of 21 from possessing what they're terming assault rifles. My concern is mainly about the definition of assault rifle and the way the breadth of it seems to include a lot of things that I'm going to, I don't know if this is really an official term, and I know that there's gun people behind me, you can tell me if this is not a good term to use, but what I would call kids' guns. So for example, most kids' first weapon is a .22 rifle. Typically, like a Ruger 1022 is like your first .22 rifle. There's a lot of things you can bolt on it. That's why every kid wants a 1022 instead of any of the other alternatives. If you bolt it on, for example, I had a friend when I was a kid who had a 1022 that had a thumb hole stock on it. That would make it an assault rifle under this bill, even though it is very much it's a weapon that's good for plinking tin cans, dealing with raccoons that go after the chickens, and not much else. But by certain of these, and it's a weapon that is very typically.
I can't see you well shooting chickens.
Oh, not shooting chickens, shoot. When I was shooting raccoons, yes. That's my first gun was given to me.
Protecting the chickens.
Yeah, when I was old enough to be told, now it's your job to shoot the raccoons that go after the chickens. That was.
Oh, okay, I missed the raccoon.
Yeah. No, not shooting. You wouldn't want to shoot a chicken with 22. I think that would be bad for everybody. But these are really like typical firearms that are used, that are possessed by young people as part of how you learn to be a responsible gun owner. Is that at some point in your life somebody gives you a 1022 and you go out plinking tin cans and keeping the raccoons away from the chickens with it. Certain variations on a 1022, even though it's just a little rimfire 22 rifle, would be made illegal under this. Same, for example, I had a friend who had a Henry AR-7. It's a 22 rifle that it was actually made for Air Force pilots to be able to keep in an airplane in case they crashed it. It's a survival rifle. It just packs down into its own stock. But because it packs down into its own stock under the definition of gear, that would be an assault rifle.
I believe
so
the definition came from other states and Congress definitions.
And I don't want to get into the sort of the federal legal issues, just in terms of trying to make sure that from my perspective, looking out for kids in Vermont, that this doesn't do too much to impact sort of what are very much kind of traditional childhood Vermont experiences. Just to keep that definition narrow enough that we're not swooping in.
My brother grew up not protecting the chickens, but with a 1022 as well, and he flagged this as well. But my question for you is, If it is a 22 the kind of highest caliber, like would exempting 22 calibers from this protect that youthful experience of learning to hunt?
You want to talk to somebody who knows more than I do. Like I said, for my entire hunting career, I've done nothing but shoot turkeys and to keeping raccoons away from the chickens. So you want to talk to somebody with a lot more
Fair point.
experience than me.
Anything else from Marcia? So let me know.
I will reach out to Erica and let you know.
Thank
you.
Rebecca, we've got about 9 minutes. And I don't want to cut you short, if you want to come back at a later time, or you want to just start, because I do have to stop at noon time.
And I'll defer to what the committee would like to do. I certainly do have more than 9 minutes. I'm happy to start in, but I'm also.
I think it may be more comfortable if we have you back, if that's possible.
Yeah,
I'd like to make
fine.
sure we have enough time to hear everything.
Yeah.
My brain will do a better job.
I think if we can fit you in next Friday, we have a person from Duke University. Not named the basketball coach.
Shashevsky.
Do you know the name of that person?
Yeah, Daryl Miller is the co-director of the Duke Fire and Ball Center. He's coming on 9:30 to 10:30, I think, so it'll be an hour after.
Since we have a few minutes, can I ask the defense attorneys what's becoming my favorite question now about straw purchasing? The word demand in that provision. Do you have thoughts on it? I mean, I think I asked the question earlier, and I have feelings about it, and I'm just wondering what your takes might be.
Do you want to go first? You want me to go first?
Go ahead. I have some thoughts. I'm sure you have some thoughts.
My thoughts may not be as sophisticated as yours. My thought is, I have no idea what the word demand means, and it doesn't seem to be defined anywhere. And I don't see any definitions from anywhere else in criminal law that would necessarily translate over. So to me, it means whatever you can convince a judge to believe it means.
Thank you.
Yeah, for the record, Rebecca Turner, how about I join what Marshall just said, and I have additional thoughts on that section as well, outside of the group.
Okay, yeah, sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else this morning? Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. And we'll continue